Hello, and welcome to Student Affairs Assessment, Priorities and Focus During COVID-19, a part of Campus Intelligence, your source for reimagining data in higher ed. My name is Tyler McLean, and I serve as a manager at Campus Labs, and will be aiding Dr. Ann Lundquist in helping to facilitate today's webinar. I'd like to introduce Dr. Ann Lundquist and let her take it away.
Great, Tyler. Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. I can see a lot of you are logged in or logging in right now. We appreciate your time today. I'm Ann Lundquist, and I'm Assistant Vice President of Campus Strategy at Campus Labs. And in that role, I work primarily with our student affairs campuses and with a lot of my colleagues around the country. So I'm excited to see a lot of you on the call today and to be joined today by some great folks to talk about student affairs assessment, particularly during these times. So the focus of our conversation today is to talk about the changed landscape and to think about some key questions that we've put together. We're going to think about how priorities may have shifted, what does that mean for student affairs, and what some of the priorities and relevant data are for you right now. We'll try to offer some tips and advice, and we've also reached out to some other colleagues, so we'll include some other voices in this conversation as well. So now I'm going to let my colleagues introduce themselves, and then we'll move on with our conversation. So CG?
Hi, I'm CG Heiser. I'm the Director for Assessment and Effectiveness at Western Michigan University. I'm also the Member at Large for the Student Affairs Assessment Leaders.
Hi, everyone. I'm Daniel Dorr. I currently coordinate and lead assessment efforts for the Division of Student Affairs at UConn, and I am the Advancement Committee Chair-elect for SAAL.
My name is Joe Levy. I'm the Executive Director of Assessment and Accreditation for the university at National Louis University in Chicago, Illinois, and I serve as the Professional Development Committee Chair for SAAL.
And I'm Judd Harbin. I am the Executive Director for Strategic Planning and Assessment in the Division of Student Affairs at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas.
Great, thank you so much. So we want to get our conversation started here with this first question, just about from hearing from folks here about what the shift to remote environment means for assessment professionals. There's been a lot about the shift for all student affairs folks, and we're pretty well aware of that. But for assessment professionals in particular, what that shift has looked like. So Judd, I'll lead off with asking you that question.
Sure, thanks. So one of the things that I think this has led to is a lot of people thinking, oh, our students are now online. They're online so that they can take their classes remotely, so they can work remotely, they can communicate with their families. That means that they're online, so that we pay more attention to our requests when we send out surveys or questionnaires or polls. And I'm like, well, that on its surface, that might make sense, but their capacity or their attention span is still the same amount. And now all these other things have been dumped into that online attention span. So their attention for any given online assessment project is actually less than what they would have had before. In addition, some of our students who may, for example, if they're living off campus or if they were on campus and now they're off because we've reduced the occupancy in our halls, they may not have access to the same kind of Wi-Fi that they had before. They may have a more limited plan at their home than they would have had in a residence hall on campus or at the library or the student union or a computer lab. So they don't necessarily have the same opportunity or the same access at home that they might have had elsewhere. Can create some inequities there.
Great, and we're going to talk quite a bit here about ideas related to what that means for data collection and methods and things. And since CG, for you, how has your role shifted or changed?
Yeah, so for me at Western, there's a lot of large-scale collaborative projects happening around assessment, and so I'm finding myself doing a bigger lift to move those projects forward so that faculty can be free to focus on this drastic shift that's just happened into the online space. So helping to carry bigger pieces of like HLC accreditation, for example, because our site visit's coming up, and helping to sustain operations while acknowledging that my colleagues and peers have just had this like monumental task thrust upon them. And so we see staff stepping up in those ways. I think we also are moving away from our annual summative evaluation. So we typically engage in at the end of the year, and we're moving towards a more comprehensive understanding of needs assessments in terms of students And we'll talk more about this later, but also faculty and staff as we try to plan for the future.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. And Dan, how has your role changed?
Yeah, I would echo both what Judd and CG have said. I think from a slightly different perspective, I would focus on kind of my role within a student affairs, like working with other staff. And I think, so part of my role is always to get people to think about assessment priorities, but I think more so now than ever, I'm really trying to encourage folks to think very strategically about, given the sort of bandwidth limitations Judd talked about, what really are our priorities? And to pick up CG's point about summative assessment, maybe that we just put off the table for now, right? And focus on what are those needs assessments, what do we need to do to get data that's actionable in the right now. The other piece that I think is I have found is assessment is always, there's always the challenge that assessment can feel like an add-on to folks. And I think that has been exacerbated in the current situation. So finding bandwidth for staff to engage them in conversations around assessment, I think I've had to recalibrate a bit my own, how much I'm inserting myself into other folks' work schedules right now in recognition of what they're having to address on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. Joe, how about you?
Yeah, I'm glad I went a little last because our institution's on the different end of the spectrum. We have a lot of online programs, as well as the majority of our other programs are offered in a hybrid modality, meaning that students are already doing some online and limited face-to-face. So certainly there's been transition and stress and added work with all the changes as of late, but in comparison to majority of other institutions, we had a lot of the infrastructure in place, and it wasn't as large of an operational adjustment as maybe some other institutions. And even with our student body, we have a lot of adult students who aren't necessarily living on campus, only receiving services and programs in person. So we already had some online services around student affairs. But I would echo a bit of what, pick up on what Dan was saying in terms of, I think for student affairs assessment professionals, regardless of what your assessment culture was, or perhaps your work style and relationships that you have with people, I think we're all shifting into a very specific world of being empathetic and trying to offer as much support as possible, even beyond assessment support, as well as trying to then, by already positioning yourself as a support and ally for them, be a bit of that gentle reminder for the assessment that does need to happen. Certainly there's changes that we have to make and some things we can back off, absolutely, echoing what some others had said in terms of new priorities. But given the stressors and the new changes and things they're having to accommodate and deal with students, we have to make sure we're playing a bit of that human reminder for them, which sometimes when you have a great assessment culture or you have great assessment champions, you don't have to do that. And you can just, send them the report link or send them the template and know that they'll fill it out and know that they'll be following on their assessment plan that you decided on in the fall. So I think it's really important that we remember that even if people aren't knocking on our door, that we might have to be gently knocking on theirs. And to Dana's point, being very aware of how much we might be inserting ourselves in their world and just being understanding of that and echoing what others said with whatever has to get done, trying to collaboratively define that, but also being aware of, as CG pointed out, we might have accreditation or other external needs that we have to report to, and so being as intentional with that as we can, and trying to also position that in a way that still reinforces work we're expected to do and that helps our students, but then is also meeting external requirements.
Great, really good points, all of you. I gathered a couple of thoughts from a couple other folks here. Melissa Brown is at University of Tennessee, and I think she's echoing what a lot of you are saying about assessment professionals being as important as ever. I think there's been a little bit of this, who is an essential, non-essential employee conversation, I think, on most campuses. And I like what she says about assessment is taking a deeper look into an outcome and discerning the areas of weakness in order to implement improvement. We know that's always the case, but you all have mentioned this idea of it needing to be kind of really actionable, or maybe around different outcomes than were just determined at the beginning of the year. And then we had another thought, I think, on the next slide from Kelly Dixon at North Carolina A&T. And she talks about her role, feeling like her role is even more critical now, thinking about campus climate, and this idea of how you were positioned maybe before the need to shift can have some impact on how easy or well you can make the pivots. I think we're all learning a lot, probably, Joe, from our campus folks who've already done good job with remote student services and remote learning. So moving to our next question, you may not have as much more to add here, but are there some priorities that you might highlight that are staying the same, that kind of carry on in the continuity of them, even with the COVID-19 shift and the remote employ here? CG, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, so even amidst this COVID and everything that it has brought onto universities, I think we still have a really strong commitment to equity, and we're aware of the fact that this transition may exacerbate inequities. And Judd was speaking to this earlier when he was talking about access to Wi-Fi, access to basic resources, and so we have like a small focus on things like our food pantry and data around that, and our student emergency relief funding, and now we're noticing that those are shifting higher up in the priorities. So they've always been important, and we've had a focus on them, but we're noticing this big realignment of we need to have the numbers around this now and kind of on a daily basis. So I think that understanding how those inequities might be exacerbated for whom and how we can resolve those is really important for helping students to re-enroll next fall, which is a priority for us. I also think a priority that we already were spending attention on, was a big part of my job, was data integration and analytics. And in a conversation with my supervisor around that exact topic of essential and non-essential work, I said, I think the time is going to come where we're going to be much more hungry for information than we have been in the past. And she said, you're absolutely right, and I need you to keep chugging along on this. And I said, yes, ma'am. And so I think that continued focus on pulling all of our data together, our enrollment data, our academic data, our engagement data, all of that in one place to be able to make meaning out of how to best tailor outreach to students right now is really important.
Great, thank you. Joe, how about you? You've mentioned a few, but any other priorities that you see as just carrying on at this time?
Yeah, I think, and I don't want to steal my thunder for a future question, but I think a big thing for us, the priority that remains the same is serving students, right? Yeah. And doing the best we can for students. And as much as we can, sticking to our mission and our values, both as an institution as well as within each functional area. And so while our interventions may look different and things might be shifted right now, and our typical student population in terms of what we knew and what we were planning for and expecting, that is changing on a daily basis. We still have to stay true to that, and I think in light of that, I think then that's where a bit assessment stays a priority, and because we have to know that what we're doing is working, right? And as much as we sit around in a room and think this is what's going to be best for students right now, we need to know if that's actually helping them, right? If we offer this in this way, is that meeting their needs now, or is it just exacerbating, as Judd was alluding to earlier, is this just further crowding and filling up more noise in a space that they typically reserved for some other type of engagement or other populations. But I think that's it's a challenge I think we've been meeting operationally, but I think then we have to, a bit to CG's point, we have to make sure that we're collecting the data and doing it, especially now, in a way that's not taxing or troubling, or people moan and groan, because then they're not going to want to do it. But we still need the data, both for right now to make sure we're being responsive to students, but then also, we have to be thinking about post shelter at home life and future reports and future audits and accreditations, where certainly there'll be some grace given to us. But I think that the piece that we can't lose sight of is that while organizationally and big reports and accreditors institutions will get grace for what's going on right now, what we're not going to get another redo of is the lived experience of our students.
Absolutely.
And so we need to be checking in on that for sure.
Great point. Great point. Thank you so much. I was on a call yesterday. I'll just insert before I ask Judd here with some other member campus folks from Campus Labs, and Drew Thiemann from Bellarmine said we need to explore but not exploit our students. I just really appreciated that. Like, we want to know, but we don't want to exploit. So I wrote it down and I've been looking at it ever since. So, Judd, what are your thoughts about what stayed the same?
So I definitely agree with CG and Joe on the points that they've already raised, and appreciate kind of the hat tip to my earlier remarks that each of them made. I think that one of the really important things for us right now is kind of maintaining our sense of ethics, making sure that what we are doing is helpful, that we are still fulfilling promises, and that we are doing this in a way that is just and equitable. I think that's really important right now. I appreciated Joe's comments about keeping students at the forefront, and what I would add to that is that particularly for my office, I have very little direct interaction with students. So for me, it's more about making sure that I'm still providing the support to the staff who are providing the support to the students, so that they can still make sure that what they are doing is having the intended impact.
Great point. Thank you so much. And Dan, how about you?
I would echo what's been said already. I don't have a great deal to add. I do think I'm fortunate, like others, to work at an institution that is very focused on meeting the needs of students and keep students centered in all their work. And so I think this is no different. It looks different now, but that priority is no different. I think I would add that, in some ways, I think as assessment professionals, we may have a little bit of potentially a little bit of luxury to keep moving forward projects that other staff might not have right now. And so, I've also been able to focus some energy on projects and keep those projects moving forward. And I think that's something that assessment professionals could contribute right now, since we may not be having as much, sort of urgent need, emergency response, responding to student kind of things. And so whether it's, data integration and analytics, like CG mentioned, or other projects that require a bit of dedicated time, those things, I think recognizing that those things are important and could continue even while other folks may be in much of a sort of response mode, I think is a valuable kind of perspective to have. And I think we'll talk a little bit more later about that. It could potentially provide other staff with some additional focus and a positive project for them to work on as well in this context as sort of things begin to normalize a bit.
Great, thank you so much. It is reminding me this week, and the idea of what remains the same. We're all kind of, when we think about the 9 principles of good practice for assessing student learning, I showed CG right before. I've got my student affairs assessment book and my assessment student affairs, right here on my desk. But these ones jumped out at me. The idea of outcomes that you mentioned, but also to the experiences that lead to those outcomes. And number 7, assessment works best when it begins with issues of use and illuminates questions people care about. I mean, that's always true, but I think it's very true right now. And also how we meet, several of you mentioned this, how we meet our responsibilities to students and the public. So, and I think we have a couple other quotes, Tyler, from a few other colleagues in the field. You'll get these slides. I won't read all of this, but Ria and I have talked quite a bit, and we were supposed to present together at NASPA, but she talks about being more committed than ever to community well-being. That's always been a focus for them. So as CG mentioned, the food pantry, things that are already a priority, it just highlights that, and the assessment around whether it's working or not carries on. And then I think we might have another one, Tyler, also from Kelly Dixon. She mentions here, and this may lead to our next question or conversation point about data collection, but including students in the process we know is always a good idea. It doesn't always happen. And so she talks about feeling a sense of belonging when they can assist with improvement plans for various units. So this idea that you all have mentioned about finding out how they're doing, and then ways to include them in the whole assessment process.
And we have a question. One of our attendees asked, we're now being asked to provide low-skill tasks that colleagues with more free time could complete remotely that would move our assessment agenda forward in the long run. Are there items you could think of, this attendee said that they've suggested like program review, evidence gathering, inventories, previous assessment items, like are there other things that people could be completing with the free time that they might have?
I don't know if anyone wants to take that right now. It does lead into our next question, where we're going to talk about what methods or what procedures or processes are relevant right now. But so practices and approaches are particularly useful. So ponder that question, you all, when you answer that, and see if you have things to respond to that one as well. I think, Dan, we were going to start off with you about practices and approaches that you think are particularly useful. So we started talking about the meta landscape, and now, like on a very practical level, are there types and strategies and approaches that you're using or you think are important?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll highlight a couple of thoughts I've had from discussions with others, and just sort of in my own work. Again, I guess I'd start with the prioritize, right? And from a point of practice, really encouraging folks to think those priority questions through in terms of what data are going to be actionable and necessary. And while documentation is, of course, important for purposes of accreditation and external stakeholders, that may be a secondary level of prioritization. But that's depending on where institutions are in terms of their accreditation cycles and all of those kinds of things. But prioritization is a major piece that I think deserves focus for staff right now in terms of assessment. I also think we all have a tendency, I think, to use surveys a lot, right? And we tend to ask questions that cover a range of data points that we think are relevant. And I think now is the time I would encourage folks to flip that a little and think, what are the minimal data points that I need right now to make a decision or to understand whether we are being successful? And how do you collect those, right? So sending out surveys to people may not be the most efficacious right now. So do you insert, a sort of quick link in all your communication with students that just takes them to a 1 or 2 question sort of, that kind of ongoing, customer satisfaction survey kind of approach that maybe asks them questions about how they're experiencing the services that you're providing to them, 1 or 2 questions. I was thinking this morning and talking with our Dean of Students office about there may be valuable assessment that's done without putting additional burden on students. So, all of the deans are interacting with students on a daily basis. And rather than asking students what their biggest challenge is right now in those transitions or what themes are coming up, the deans themselves could compile weekly notes and then review them together to try to identify what are the trends and themes they're seeing that are emerging kind of integrated in their work, rather than trying to reach out to students for additional information gathering or data gathering. So I think those are a couple of methodology sort of practice questions that I've thought of. I think really the focus should be on minimizing the assessment intervention to maximize the information that you need for whatever decisions or purposes you need in the moment.
Really good point. It echoes the other note I wrote down from Bellarmine from Drew Thiemann yesterday. He said they're doing a 2-question assessment, and the only 2 questions are, how are you doing? What can we do to help? And I really like that. It's talk about, paring your survey way back, and it's very open-ended. All right. So Joe, thoughts that you have about the practices and approaches that are particularly relevant right now?
I think one of the things to stress is that approaches and methods do not need to be complex. And I think that's a good reminder and an apprehension. It may have even been like a myth that we busted in a previous webinar, but people can get intimidated with assessment because they might think it has to be this very complex, very intricate, very detailed process, when in fact it could be as simple as a reflection. It could be as simple as, a staff member reaching out to students and having them just share back how they're doing and what they're getting from an experience in the form of a reflection or of verbal, just sharing. So I think it's important for people to remember that to move forward with assessment and engage in practice right now, it doesn't have to be something super complex. And even if we are doing a survey, it doesn't have to be maybe a typical survey that we might do. It can be those 2 questions. It can be instead of a survey, if we want to ask those 2 questions and have them just submit back, a little journal response. It can be that. I think what more than ever, we have to balance good design principles of being very clear on what it is we need to measure, and not just what we want to measure right now, but what we have to measure, and then thinking through, ideally how we would do that, and then working through the constraints that we have in terms of resources and access and what we think our students would best respond to. And so that process may look different than it usually looks for us, but when you walk through those steps, you'll hopefully arrive then at something that you feel good about and that your students would feel good about too. And then you'll be getting your data and it'll be useful for you. And if it's not, just like any other assessment process, you iterate and you can try again and hopefully learn from it. But I think one thing that is very useful now more than ever is that the people that are collecting the data should be sharing their experience with others. And I think I'm even experiencing that at my institution, where I helped our VPSA put together a survey to go out to students about how they're doing, and I don't know what those results are, and I don't know what those insights were, and I don't know if and maybe he has been sharing that with his, everyone in the division, but I would highly encourage people to be doing that and not be keeping that just within your office or your team, because even though another office, they're not doing the same thing, they're dealing with the same students. And so let them learn from, the lessons that you're learning, tell them what's working for you, what your students are telling you. I think that's a very useful thing right now and applies to methods, but also transcends it a bit.
Yeah, and also good practice all the time. Again, one of these examples of things that we know is good practice, and it usually is tough. So getting ourselves out of that habit and really, really sharing the data. CG, what are your thoughts?
We've really shifted gears to collaborating for outreach. And so we know that many of the advisors and student support specialists in the colleges are reaching out to college-specific students. And so rather than send out a survey, we have taken the opportunity to say, what are our critical questions? One of which is, do you plan to enroll in the fall, right? And so working with academic advisors to ask 1 to 2 critical questions while they're already doing these outreach calls. On the flip side, we also have Residence Life, who's touching base either with the students who are still on campus or to every student who did log on campus to check, like, do you need to come get some stuff? Are you fully out? Are you coming back? So they're already reaching out with a script to ask a few questions. And so working with them to ask 1 or 2 additional critical questions and using that as an opportunity. So we've really swung from like this anonymous, semi-decontextualized survey to this really individualized one-on-one outreach, and everybody has their spreadsheets that they're just entering their yes/no keyword that we kind of predefined as a code that might pop up into these spreadsheets as they go. Regarding the question that was asked earlier that I think also applies to this, I think I would say it's a really good opportunity to capitalize on your existing data. One of the things I was talking about with my conduct team is they have had years of data in when they made a switch to a new platform that started tracking all of their cases. And I was like, okay, use that data to project out how many academic integrity cases you usually have in this last quarter and use that to plan your hours effectively. And so we were talking about what is our normal operation at this point in the year? How are we typically engaging students? And how can we use our past information around what student needs have been at the end of the year? We know they're stressed, we know it's finals, but we have an opportunity to use that to inform what's going on right now. I also work with a ton of well-intentioned people who are a little bit of data hoarders, but I have to send the survey out on the schedule because I want my longitudinal data. Like, sister, when was the last time you looked at that longitudinal data? And so now's a really good time to dig into that because you have this space that maybe you don't normally have in a typical workday. I think Joe calls it, you call it data negligence, right? When you kind of have all this data and it's just sitting there. And so now's the opportunity to get curious with your data and really draw those connections that you've been meaning to for a while, if that applies to your circumstance.
Great response. I think a couple things that you mentioned were consistent with it. This was on our call yesterday as well. This was North Carolina Central. They did a similar thing where they had those critical questions and they broke the whole student body into cohorts by different categories. So it could be athletic teams, it could be residence halls, et cetera, so that every student had a touch point. And then those critical questions were asked by the person with whom they had the closest, say, contact or relationship. So the idea of who the sender of the questions it wasn't just coming from the university. It was my coach, my advisor, my hall director, or whatever for that student. And then they've got this master spreadsheet where they're tracking that. And then someone in the assessment role is sort of trying to, take a look at that and see what the relevant themes or categories are to inform action and outreach. So I thought that was a really good suggestion as well. Judd, thoughts that you're having?
I think that my colleagues have done a great job of covering a lot of it. What I would kind of add to this is I think it really does, their comments already speak to the importance of the intentionality of making sure that we know what we need to gather, what kind of data we need to gather, what kind of questions we need to answer. And then we should be reaching out and answering those questions in the simplest and most straightforward way possible. I love the 2 questions approach. I love what CG was mentioning that their campus is doing in collaboration with academic advisors. So it's not one more survey that the students are getting right now. Another idea that was an opportunity that I had on my own campus, someone came to me and said, hey, could we send out a survey asking our students if they have the technology that they need in order to access the LMS? I was like, well, it seems like the folks in the office that manage the LMS could probably tell us some information about who is logging in, who is not. And then maybe we reach out to the people who are not logging in to find out what are the barriers for them. That's all kind of also outside of my realm, so I don't know how fully that has been realized, but it was something that I did mention. And the last thing that I would mention here is the importance of self-care. We as assessment professionals are still human beings, so I think one of the important practices for us right now is to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves. At the same time, we're helping to take care of staff and maybe providing support and service to students, but we also are human beings and we need to practice some good self-care and make sure that we have people that we are reaching out to for support at this time too.
Excellent reminder. And it's a lot of headspace work too, assessment. So all the other parts of our well-being can get lost on a regular day, but maybe even more so during this time.
One other thing I thought of, it was a bit as CG was talking about using existing data, is I think, and it answers the person's question about what people can be doing. I think now is also an excellent opportunity, especially if services look different and maybe staff have some newfound time. Now's a great time to involve more people in assessment. I think far too often we have like the director of an office that is shouldering all of assessment activity. And when they have so many other things to worry about, it's easy for assessment to take a back seat. And so now can be a good time to bring some of those other people into the process or give them some of those projects, as CJ was mentioning, of we have this survey data, can you look at this section? And can you look at this section? And can you, report back to me, or let's, share at the next team meeting about what we found, or think about this in relation to your area. To the extent that makes sense and, wouldn't just, require then a lot of training or orientation for people, I think it's a good time to really delegate and bring more people into that process.
Yeah, so we had someone comment earlier when we were talking about qualitative analysis, and they said to the extent possible, it might be worth conducting more qualitative analysis. This week in particular, there's been a lot in the news about students, how they don't feel that remote learning is providing the same experience to them, and that, they would love for people to dive into the conversation about understanding what students are getting and what they're not getting. And then another question came in / comment is about this individual would like to know more about the critical questions that you all have referred to and what those critical questions are.
CG, why don't you respond to that, and then we'll move into data collection methods, because I think you that qualitative question, and there's some ideas from you all and others about just maybe some specific approaches that could be particularly helpful right now. So CG, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so some of the critical questions that are being asked are, are they planning to come back to campus housing in the fall? Are they planning to enroll in the fall? What's working in the online environment for them, so we know not to change that. For their advisors, it's making sure that they have access to the resources, because our campus isn't closed, but we look really different than we ever have in our history right now. It's making sure that students know how to access those traditional resources just in a new way. I'm trying to think if there are any other critical questions we were asking off the top of my head. Yeah, that's all I can think of off the top of my head right now, but if I think of any more, I'll chime back in.
Great, thanks. And I also, in response to Judd's idea, I was thinking also on our call yesterday, Iowa Wesleyan was doing a similar thing to what you're describing. So these partnerships between academic affairs, sort of across the traditional silos. They're using faculty reports from logging into the LMS, like you said. The fact there's a weekly report, and then that's getting referred back to student affairs or the relevant offices where people can do the action and the outreach. So, kind of closing that loop between the data and what the action is requires an institutional conversation. Just a couple quick thoughts from some of our other colleagues. Nick Kerwald at Kentucky talks about the priorities remaining the same, thinking about student connection and belonging. I think that conversation is probably elevated campus-wide in a way that may not have happened on all campuses. So he talks about the disruption being helpful in some ways as professionals create more inclusive programs where students who may not have participated in such programs will now, or weren't able to, now may be able to. So there's, we can also look at the upside of what we're learning right now about student involvement and engagement and participation, even though it's in a remote environment, because our campuses are still providing co-curricular programming, albeit in a different way. Melissa also talks about this idea, I think several of you mentioned this, about guiding the offices within the division. That's often a role of an assessment director, but you all mentioned some great ideas for doing that. And the data sharing as being so important. Sending fewer emails and surveys, and she's focusing on modifying the way that they do their annual planning. So I think I've also heard from some folks that responded to me, and maybe back to our comment earlier, not that you're not doing program review or end of year reporting, but you rethinking the shift to how and what's exactly important, maybe changing the template, maybe changing the information that is needed to be reported on or collected to be meaningful at this time. And then Dana from Rutgers talked about, the financial implications that are still uncertain in terms of staffing, student enrollment. And so she talked about a little bit about her role, about being involved in the financial and revenue loss, bringing that assessment and planning lens to those financial conversations is a contribution assessment professionals can make. And I liked her quote here where she said it's, people are trying to think fast and operating in a crisis mode. So she's trying to be that person that asks people to slow the thinking down a little bit and kind of put that, what's important, why are we doing this, which is a lens that assessment professionals can bring. And then Kelly talks about exploring creative ways to assess the needs and learning of our students via technology is very important at this point in time. So I think that moves us to another question, which is tied, and you've already mentioned a few things. So if people have other ideas about what data is particularly relevant right now. Joe, I don't know if you have thoughts, things you haven't already mentioned, but what kind of data or what types of data do you think is really important right now?
I didn't know if Tyler had a comment before I go, or if
one of the attendees wrote in and said that I think one of the important concepts that keeps coming up in the assessment webinars that they've been attending is that what we're doing right now is not so much online learning, it's more crisis response learning, which I thought was a really interesting perspective. And this attendee agrees that it's important to keep that in mind for our work, but that distinction is a lot more meaningful to us as professionals versus to the students that are participating in the crisis response learning.
Yeah. And, So when I think about what data is relevant right now, tying in some themes from what we've been saying all along is there's been a lot of chatter and conversation around perhaps not doing assessment this year. And it's interesting because it's framed as we shouldn't do assessment. There's been talks of like Maslow before Bloom's, and I think certainly there's some truth in there, but I think sometimes people are conflating some aspects of assessment, maybe a process than the practice itself. And I think it's really important to untangle those, decouple those, because I think, again, going back to what's critical now, our mission and serving students. And so the data relevant right now are very basic questions, building off of CG's critical question. It's what are we hoping students are going to learn? What impact do we hope our services are going to have? And how do we know that's happening and to what extent that's happening? And while those are critical questions we need to answer right now outside of the assessment conversation, they are assessment questions. I mean, they are the fundamental core of what assessment is. And so, I always, smirk when people say like, assessment should be the last thing on our minds right now, because it's like, no, it should be on our minds. Now, I think there is plenty of truth. And as we've talked about, we shouldn't necessarily move forward with our existing structures or, the reports maybe we had in place and what we were planning to do, or the methods and maybe all the data we were planning to collect. That may look different, but the core of what we're doing still hasn't changed. And so I think we need to remember that. And when we ask those questions of ourselves, it should be pretty clear to answer then what data is relevant. That being said, we have to be, and we've mentioned it a little bit here and there about, equity considerations. We have to be very careful of the decision makers and their identities and their lived experiences, because what I think is relevant data right now may be different than what CG thinks is relevant data right now, may be different what Judd thinks. And that's all from our mental models and our lenses and our experiences and the students that we work with. So we need to make sure that when we're making these decisions, we have a diverse representation of perspectives there. And as much as we can without stressing, it's ideal to have some student perspectives involved too. Ask them like, what do you think is important for us to know right now about you and what's going on with the students? And so the more we do that, the better we'll get to this relevant data piece.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joe. We've got about 10 more minutes. So Judd, thoughts that you have about relevant data right now?
I certainly echo what Joe has already said. What I would add to that is I think that it's important for us to review the data that we have kind of going into this. And then, again, with intentionality, is think about what are the critical questions that we need to be able to answer about how all of this experience has changed the experience and the outcomes for our students. Are they still getting from their experiences what we wanted them to get, or what we do want them to get?
Great. Yes. And CG?
Right. So we just took students, we're student affairs practitioners, right, by and large. And so we just took students and removed them from one of the most critical functions that student affairs provides, which is affinity for the institution and community, a sense of community and belonging. And so, yeah, even if we want to take the Maslow's argument, that third rung is friendships, relationships, sense of community and belonging. And so one of the things that we're looking at with data integration is like for those students who have engaged in our community, who have found a sense of community, how is that impacting enrollment? How is that impacting their postgraduate outcomes? How is that impacting other things? Because for me, that's work generation for an entire division. That's that validation for those practitioners to continue to do that virtual engagement and outreach in the end of the semester and as we move into summer and certainly in planning for the fall. And so I think, how do you continue to provide that sense of community in meaningful ways for students, especially those students who might fall through the cracks, right? You've got your highly vulnerable students that are identified. You've usually got some boutique programs designed to meet those needs. You've got your rock stars who are engaging in the virtual, like, I was an RSO president for 3 years running, and like they're at the recognition events, they're doing the things, but there are thousands of students in the middle, and making sure that they get what they need and they're so connected to their community especially as we approach finals, right? An already intense, stressful time period for students.
Really good points. Thanks so much. And Dan, what are your thoughts about this?
I think we've touched on what I'm about to mention in a couple of ways, and I do think it's very related to considerations of equity and access. But we know there are impediments to student success that are structural, right? Financial, housing and food insecurity, being able to keep an eye on how those things are changing and who's being impacted by that, right? I mean, we all know that millions of people are losing their jobs, right? And students are losing income, parents are losing income, trying to understand where are those financial needs, where are those housing or food insecurity needs, how do we patch them in the immediate, and what's that going to look like in the fall, right, when students come back, and are we going to be prepared and understand where that need is already, or are we going to, how is that going to play out in the fall when students come back? How are we preparing ourselves to be ready to support student success from those sort of in respect to those structural kinds of issues and challenges students will be facing, probably more so now than ever.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I was thinking too, again, from different webinars I've been on and some conversations and some work we did looking at some of our campuses that we work with Campus Labs, it seemed like this idea of campuses that already had some strong assessment practices in place, where there'd been a lot of training and staff development and all the good work, they might have some found time, as you call it, to go back and do some of this work. For campuses where that's been on their agenda, or they don't have an assessment coordinator, this may not be the time. So I think it's a lot of these things are going to vary campus to campus, both culture, skills, the level and role of assessment. And the other thing I've been thinking about is, while we know, especially to Joe's point, that assessment practices have some very common themes, I think inside the classroom and outside the classroom, we know can be very different. And this conversation about whether we should assess things may be related to the fact of course evaluations at end of term and what that means. We in student affairs can also bring the enrollment, engagement, involvement, affinity data to the table, and sometimes that is the place where we can shine and offer that data to the rest of the institution. Nick has a nice quote here about focusing on every marginalized student population and the disruption. So he's echoing what a lot of you have been saying about figuring out impacted populations. He mentions graduate students in particular. I think this is a really relevant point here. They have often been in that hybrid role of being a student and also maybe being a teaching assistant or a research associate, and they may not have a job, or the income that they had may have shifted. So we have all different types of populations based on our institutional type. Kelly also mentions, I liked her quote here. She said, just how they're succeeding, how you're succeeding as an institution around co-curricular programming and services that are most critical right now, sort of those that where people used to take part in them potentially in person and now they're not. And she said, she spoke to students, and this is her takeaway, it sucks we can't just walk to the dining hall or meet up with friends in the student center. It feels like all we have is class, and professors are not prepared for teaching online, and I'm not prepared to be taught virtually. So this kind of lived experience, felt experience of the student, I thought she did a nice job of highlighting that. And then Dana says, what a couple of you have already mentioned, leverage existing data. And here's an example of one thing she's doing. Going back to their data and comparing student involvement in recreation activities, pre-college, their interests, and then their activities during college with actual utilization records. So this is kind of like CG, student conduct. It's a good idea, a good assessment project probably keeps dropping down. And if we especially take Judd's ideas of including others in departments to maybe take on a project like this that would bring some good information forward that could then be used. We're going to end our question here with how we shift from being reactive to being proactive and intentional moving forward. So maybe a thought from each of you on that, and then we're going to wrap with a little bit about what SAAL and Campus Labs are doing here to try to help you at this time. So CG, how do we shift from being reactive to proactive?
I think that we've mentioned all of the thoughts that I've had along the way, so I'll just make straightforward summative points. Tailoring outreach in ways that maybe we haven't had capacity to do in the past, and now we need to do. Understanding the impact of community involvement on your specific campus using past data, identifying the needs of students not only now, but what they anticipate their future needs will be, and also the needs of staff and faculty as we stay in this mode for a little while longer. I think that it's really important to touch base with all three of those core populations. I think it's important to map student outreach and engagement in ways that maybe, again, we've always intended to do, but now we need to do. Because when you map your engagement and outreach, you also identify your gaps, and that's critical right now. And I think I would leave it at that and leave room for my colleagues here.
Great. Joe, how about you?
I think one of the best ways for us to shift to being a bit more proactive is to, and that the current environment has helped with that, is it's jolted us out of our current practice and what we were used to. And there's a good thing to that, especially from an assessment perspective, because there's a lot of times that we can put things on autopilot, or we can have our services, we can have the things that we do, and there are a lot of assumptions being made about what those are doing, who they're serving, and what we're learning from that. And now, with a lot of that being changed, it provides us an opportunity to take a step back and really reevaluate do all of our outcomes and intentions still match up, and are we doing the best things we can be to try and provide for students, as well as ensure that we're meeting their needs. So from a proactive perspective, we can reflect, which I know sounds a little paradoxical, but we can reflect on what we're doing, and then where we need to make any changes or adjustments, look to do that, and try and anticipate both a potential, as much as we can return back to normal services or normal operation, as well as what to do if we continue in the existing environment, and what to do maybe in a hybrid space where maybe the forced aspects of shelter in place are removed, but there's still voluntary aspects of it, and how do we then live in that hybrid space?
Yeah, contingency plans too. Very good. Dan?
So, we've talked a couple times about this idea of sort of found time in some ways, right? That some staff might not be engaged in all the services they would be providing normally. I think that time, if it does exist, can be used in part to what Joe just talked about in terms of reassessing your assessment practices and priorities. The other piece that I've talked to folks about is, there may be some units, like a recreation unit, that truly will find themselves soon, once they're through all their sort of response planning and contingency planning, without a lot for their staff to do. And that thinking about assessment and thinking about sort of assessment-related planning might provide a way to engage their own staff and to keep their staff positive, focused, and thinking forward, in that sort of window as the semester wraps up, and maybe we're still distancing from campuses in terms of, being able to get back and interact with students. I think there's a role that assessment and planning can play to sort of positively engage staff in that sort of gap between reaction and when we're back up and fully running.
Thank you so much. And then Judd?
Sure. What I would add here is I talk with our staff about assessment being professional reflection. It is your time to kind of step back from delivering the program and look at how the program or service was delivered, what kind of information you collected along the way, and you have the chance to reflect on whether or not that program or service met what you intended for it to. So I think that how we shift is that we shift by being assessment professionals, or incorporating assessment into our professional practice. We take that time to pause, reflect on what we've been doing, and figure out how do we need to adjust and adapt to the circumstances that we face going forward.
Thank you so much. We've got a couple slides about some tips, and I think most of these things have been mentioned already. And so I think we'll go past those, and we've got a couple other, I think I have this quote from Melissa, which I really liked. She said about being flexible, which you all have mentioned, but keeping the expectation of assessment and reporting, but a lot of the shifts that you all have talked about. And then we'll close. I'm going to let Judd talk a little bit about SAAL, and I'll mention a couple Campus Labs resources.
Thanks. I'm happy to do this in my role as past chair of the board for Student Affairs Assessment Leaders. The organization is available to everyone on the call today, as long as you are involved in student affairs assessment and you are employed in a higher ed setting. We do have some membership requirements to take a look at those, but we do offer a lot of different things to support your efforts right now. One of those being networking and support. Our listserv is a fairly active listserv with folks posting questions, asking, how are you tackling this issue? How are you tackling this other issue? And folks are chiming in and providing support for them. Not so much right now with social distancing, but we do have informal meetings at national conferences when those conferences happen. And we are active on social media through LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. We do have a professional development committee that is chaired by Joe, and my screen is right there, but on your screen somewhere else. But the professional development committee in SAAL is a very active committee. They're producing structured conversations, which are webinar style professional development opportunities that are available every month. We also have the open online course, and I know that it is running right now. I can't remember if registration is still open or not.
Registration ended. Sorry.
So next time you can participate in that if you're interested. And we have the professional development calendar, and then our advancement committee produces the Journal of Student Affairs Inquiry, which is an online journal available for free. Our website also includes our resource repository and blogs for more information about assessment topics. So if you're interested in joining SAAL, then please feel free to visit us at studentaffairs.org/join.
Great. Thank you, Judd. And then I'll just mention a couple quick things at the end. Many of you already work with us and know that you can access your consultant all the time. I would advance the slide here, Tyler, to mention we put together a website. Well, we have our own student affairs assessment tools and platforms, of course, but if you go forward, and then we have a campuslabs.com /COVID-19. This is really public-facing resources, so this is meant for all folks to be able to access them. We're keeping this up to date all the time, and we're sort of curating other resources from other organizations here as well, so hopefully this will be helpful to you. So I want to thank all of my colleagues here and all the folks that joined us today, and that thank you so much for your time today, and good luck with all of your assessment efforts, and stay safe and stay well.